And we're going to share screen before we start. Okay. Welcome. It is Sunday, the 10th of May. Happy Mother's Day to everybody. We are just about to start our CSP program with Professor Paul Liptz. It's part 2, Creating a Nation. Our subtopic for today is Moroccan Jews. Very happy to have Carol Isaacs with us in the audience. I hope you did not miss Carol's presentation this past week, live from the UK, about her graphic novel, The Wolf of Baghdad. It was terrific and ties in to what we've been doing. This program is sponsored by the Community Scholar Program of Orange County. We are officially entering our 20th year of programs. Our first year as a 100% Zoom program entity. I hope you've been enjoying what we have. We're closing in on our 30th presentation on the internet since we started in mid-March. Our program is being co-sponsored today by Temple Beth Shalom of Needham. Happy to have many of you on from my hometown of Massachusetts, my home state of Massachusetts. I grew up in Brookline and Newton, and you guys, many of you are coming in from Needham. I want to thank my good friend Peter Mesnick, who created this co-sponsorship opportunity. Thank you, Peter. We're dedicating this series in honor of Mike Lefkowitz, who is recovering from a serious head injury. I think Sheila Lefkowitz may be online, so we hope Mike is responding to treatment and getting better. Upcoming programs I wanted to mention, Lag BaOmer, May 12th, 2020. Not only is it National Jewish Get Your Hair Cut at Home Day, I'm looking forward to seeing all your photos, but we'll be having Rabbi Gringrass with us. He'll be talking about everything you need to know about Israel through the songs of Hadag Nachash. It's the third in his 3-part series of learning about Israel through its musicians. On May 14th, Rav Avi Strasberg is back for part 4 of her series entitled Love, Sex, and Relationships in Jewish Tradition. Our subtopic is Desire Gone Wild. And then May 17th, Professor Liptz returns for part 3 of Creating a Nation. We'll focus on the most compelling group of immigrants to Israel, of course, the Americans. And we hope you will join us. So that's next Sunday at 12 noon Pacific time, 3 East Coast time. If you're not on our CSP mail list, please do join us by emailing me, ARIEKATZ, the number 18, at gmail.com. And I'm happy to add you to the list so you find out about all these programs that are coming up. If you have questions as we go along, please put them into the chat and we'll try to get to them at the end of the program. And I doubt any of you are new, but maybe some of you are new. So just a few words about Paul Liptz. He's a social historian and CSP's 19th annual one-month scholar in residence this past January. He was on the Tel Aviv University faculty for 40 years, teaching graduate and undergraduate students in the Department of Middle East and African History and the International School, where he dealt with a wide range of topics. His main interests are history of the Yishuv, which is pre-state Israel, the modern state of Israel, and Arab women and nationalism in the Middle East. So with that, Paul, I'm going to
Good. Hi, good afternoon.
Get started with you.
Good, hope you're all well. I just want to say 1 or 2 comments about the Mizrahim, Middle Eastern Jews. During the month that I spent in Orange County in January, I spoke about the Yemenites, who were the group who came into Israel in 1949, 1950. Last week we did the Iraqis, who came by most of them 1950, 1951. The reason I mention it is that when we talk about the Moroccans today, you'll see that the timing of their arrival in Israel is different, and that's going to bring about some very serious issues. You've all got the handout on the Moroccan Jews, and if you haven't read it, you might want to read it after my session, because I think you'll learn a lot about how the Moroccans were looked at. It's actually the writings of one shaliach, one emissary, and it gives us an idea of how ASHKENAZI Israelis looked at Moroccans, feeling they were very, very foreign. So that's what we'll be talking about. Okay, let's start a little bit of Moroccan history. And on the next slide, we'll see, if we can just go on, please. We're looking at the earlier periods, and we're just going to take just a little bit of history. So the Moroccans are old timers. They've been there for a long, long time. First temple, and then some came during the second temple as well. The thing about Morocco, which I think is very important, is the fact that Morocco's a chaos. It's a country of chaos, very, very divided. If we compare it even with Yemen, which is a tough country through history, it had a center. It was Sana'a. Many of the Jews lived in Sana'a. It was an organized country, although oppressive. When we look at Iraq, there's no doubt the fact that the majority of the Jews lived in Baghdad meant that it was also under control. You knew who was the boss. In Morocco, it's a different structure. In Morocco, because it's the structure of the country, it's the highlands of the sea and the middle areas, it's not nearly as well organized. So we're going to find a country that basically, I'm speaking about Morocco as if it's one country, but in fact, it's many divisions, and the administrations as years go by. Ibn Khaldun is a very important Islamic scholar, 14th century scholar, sociologist, and his sociology is very, very sophisticated by any kind of analysis. And I took from his writings the following comment about Jews. Jewish insincerity and trickery, not hereditary, but acquired traits, conditioned by generations of subjection and tyranny. An interesting comment. Ibn Khaldun says that, many people would say in those days that Jews inherited certain traits, but in reality, what he says is because of the conditions that they find themselves under. By the way, if any of you are interested in Middle Age Islamic sociology, Ibn Khaldun's probably the best guy. Okay, the next slide, please.
Hold on for 1 second. We're just having a slide issue. So I'm trying to find where the slides went on my screen.
Okay, I'll talk until the next slide comes along. So when we talk about the Jews of Morocco, we're talking about a number of cities. They range from very, very traditional cities like Fez. Fez was a traditional Muslim city, and the Jews who lived there were also very traditional. And then in the more modern period, you have not the capital of Morocco where Jews move, which is Rabat, but rather to a city which in the 1900 had only a very small number. But back to the slide, late 15th century, we get an interesting influx of Jews from Spain. And those Jews from Spain were very, very sophisticated. And I'm going to make some non-politically correct comments in this presentation. My apologies, but anthropology and sociology often has to use some terminology which isn't comfortable. It's not PC, so that will come up. The Jews of Spain were better educated, more worldly than the local Moroccan Jews. And after a very short time, the nature of Judaism in Morocco changes after 1492 as a result of the influx of the Spanish Jews. Many of those Jews, by the way, took over the leadership positions and become an elite. And we'll talk a little later about the deep differences between the Moroccan Jewish elite and the many of the other groups. They had to live in the 15th century in the Melach. The Melach is a ghetto, not exactly the same as the European ghetto. Normally there were no gates or anything like that, but it was a depressing area. We see a picture there of a Melach, high buildings in some cases, and pretty depressing. This means that Jews are living in constrained conditions and would not be experiencing much of early modernity, which people, the upper class Jews, could experience. There were also restrictions distinguishing black garments, had to walk barefoot, and forbidden to ride horses. So it gives us an idea that the Jews are living in an oppressed state. And I think if we had to compare it with any Middle Eastern country, on this particular realm, we can very well compare it with Yemen. Yemenite Jews also lived under similar kind of restrictions. Thank you. Next slide, please. Marrakesh, one of the many cities. Marrakesh is at the foot of the Atlas Mountains. A comment about the Atlas Mountains. The Atlas Mountains in North Africa, where the Berber people live. And actually, Jews got on well with the Berbers, something similar to what I spoke about last week with Iraq, where the Jews in the Kurdish areas got on well. Rural traditional groups tend to cooperate with each other because conditions are so tough. Marrakesh had some very tough times. Once again, speaking about the ups and downs of Moroccan history, a serious cholera epidemic in 1558. We have already a very clear development of upper class Jews, physicians, bankers, advisors, and ambassadors. And we are beginning to see, once again, good days, bad days. We're getting an upper class Jewish community, but at the same time, in the 17th century, the Sultan, similar to a president or a king, appoints a Jewish counselor to be something like the prime minister, and there's an uproar in the country, and Jews are attacked, destroyed, synagogues destroyed, and they were fined high taxes. We haven't seen 16th century, and it's going to carry on right till the 20th century. You have a very wealthy group, maybe 5, 10, 15%, and then you have the largely poor and poverty-stricken groups who are the overwhelming majority. Pay attention to the picture, an unusual one. Women touching a Sefer Torah outside the synagogue. So that was actually happened in Moroccan society. Moroccan Judaism, by the way, is somewhat similar to conservative Judaism. They're not Ashkenazi Orthodox, they're not Ashkenazi Reform, somewhere in between, and therefore there's more kind of flexibility than you would find in regular Orthodox environments. Thank you. Next one, please. Casablanca. Casablanca, as I mentioned, became a very central place for the Jews as time went on, but only modern. So it's really only sort of in the 1880s and early 1900s that Jews moved to Casablanca. It is without doubt the most important economic city in Morocco, very modern, very nice. And here we're beginning to see what I've been emphasizing already, the tremendous division between the various groups. As we saw in Iraq, you have the AIU, the Alliance Israelite Française or Universelle, and they're already going to those schools. You're getting a Western education and you're learning French. So you're having that group which is there, and the two pictures indicate the tremendous difference. In Casablanca, at not all that different period of time, 30 or 40 years different, you have on the one hand, very traditional people looking as if they may well have come from the Berber area. And down at the bottom there, you're seeing kids in this very modern school. You have a rabbinic school, a seminary there as well. Just pay one attention to the statistics. 1951, Casablanca is without doubt the center of Moroccan Jewry, 75,000. 30, 40 years later, they've gone down to 5,000. Therefore, Morocco has been a country where you have a very significant number of Jews. We know there were over 250,000, but by the time we get to the 70s and 80s, the number has gone down. Today, they're talking about something in the region of 1,000 or 2,000. Thank you. The good time. As in Iraq, you have the British period from the First World War to 1932. In Morocco, you have French rule. French rule, the French are just on the other side of the Mediterranean, and the French add to the possibilities of upward mobility. Not everyone is getting into the French upward mobility, and the French are quite restrictive, by the way. They didn't seem to have exactly the same kind of openness which we find with the British in Iraq. And in addition to some of the restrictions that the French imposed on the Jewish population, although it was better to be a Jew than a Muslim under the French rule, we see the Vichy period, which is very uncomfortable, oppressive. In the 50s, we see the rise of terrorism. And in 1956, we have a major event which is going to influence the Moroccan Jews in a powerful way, and that is Morocco becomes independent in 1956. The state of Israel already exists. By the way, it's the same year that there's the Sinai campaign in Israel, and there's restlessness. Muhammad V has been described by many as a kind person. He had a Jewish cabinet minister, by the way, which is quite a familiar phenomenon that you find right around the Middle East. You often have a Jewish finance minister, as by the way you do at the moment in Morocco with the grandson of Muhammad V, Muhammad VI. His advisor is Jewish. There's bureaucratic anti-Semitism, and I put the word bureaucratic in to suggest that there's a difference in the behavior of the local Muslim in the ghetto with the local Jews, living very, very close together and interacting, although the Jews live in a slightly different area, but it's very close to where many Muslims live as well. And the bureaucracy, which is the result of Arab nationalism and the tremendous impact of President Nasser of Egypt, the bureaucracy in many of the Arab countries become very antagonistic to the Jewish population, who's seen as a symbol of the state of Israel. What we see here is a Casablanca modern synagogue, beautiful, by the way. And just to mention the synagogue, what Moscow is going through at the Morocco, I said Moscow, sorry. What Morocco is going through at the moment is renovating synagogues, a phenomenon which we find in Europe and we find in a few North African countries. Thank you. The good days also, 1961 to 1999, King Hassan II. So these are times when, until recently and true until today, the position of those Jews who stayed in Morocco is fine. There are almost no attacks on them. And by the way, this has led to an interesting phenomenon of nostalgia. The Moroccan Jews who had a tough time in Israel when they came, who now visiting Morocco and look back with a certain amount of nostalgia. I think they've forgotten, and that's the impact of nostalgia wherever you see it, they've forgotten some of the tough days which existed. We see that Hassan II invited the Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin to go there. In 1993, an office, it's kind of a small trade office, was opened. There are hopes, by the way, that there'll be full negotiations between the two countries. We don't have ambassadors in either of the countries at the moment. And just to show about the kind of feeling which Israeli Moroccan youngsters feel, when Hassan II died, young Israelis put up large Moroccan posters, huge posters, as a kind of respect for Hassan. And look, in addition to which, that the old marketplace, the shuk, which many years ago was very run down, has been renovated. It's basically part of the contemporary Moroccan policy. Next slide, please. Now we come to the other side of the coin. So on the one hand, we see living in Morocco has some very tough periods from the 15th century or even earlier, and good periods as well. Good and bad, things are changing all the time. And on the other hand, Moroccans are becoming more interested in Zionism. Well, though in most cases, not all cases, particularly in the early period before the creation of the State of Israel, people who wanted to come to Israel were either a relatively small number of religious people who would want to live in one of the four holy cities in what was then Palestine, Eretz Israel, or in many cases, they would come to die, to be buried in the Holy Land. But if there's a level of anti-Semitism and things aren't so good at home, then Zionism, going to the State of Israel, becomes a reasonable alternative. And we see the Balfour Declaration right around the Jewish world was very exciting. However, we found a catch now. Under British rule into Palestine, Eretz Israel, there was a certificate policy. And the British very much controlled the number of people who could come in. The Zionist movement brought people in illegally a very significant number. Next week, when we speak about the Americans, we'll speak about those Americans who assisted in the ships which brought 65 ships, which brought those people to the land of Israel. And therefore, there was preference for Holocaust survivors. As we go on, we are seeing that the statistics are going to show us ups and downs. 1948-51, Israel is created, so we're getting a significant number coming in. The big picture, 1948-64, is 220,000 came to Israel. And just to get a sense of the ups and downs, 52-54, things are relatively good. 55-57, as I mentioned, Morocco receives its independence, they're leaving. 57-60, things are okay. 61-63, HASSAN's just coming to power. He hasn't really established himself. There's insecurity. Jews are leaving. 64-67, Six-Day War. It was clear that a war was going to break out between the Arabs and the Jews. The Jews start flocking out. So that's the story. Once again, divided society, pretty much unclear when things are going to be good and when things are going to be bad. We see a picture there of a modern synagogue looking very, very Western. This is your comfortable middle class. And on the other hand, you see the people who are coming to Haifa on boats. That's how many of them arrived, by the way, via France in most cases. And they're looking, we can see from the traditional grandparents and the slightly more modern children and grandchildren. Next slide, please. What's the Israeli reality? And now we're talking about the Israeli reality, which is influenced by stereotypes. And it's unfortunate. And I'm very much aware of discrimination, having been brought up in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. But part of a stereotype is built on a very limited amount of material. The handout which you have, which you can read, is an extension of the report from the Zionist envoy. And this particular Zionist envoy looks at Morocco very much from a Western perspective. I think reading it, it sounds like discriminatory or racist, but the reality is that most people in the world analyze situations from exactly where they are. And therefore, that's why the stereotype developed. Not only was there a stereotype, but there was a divided community. And this, I know when one says this in Israel in certain frameworks, is very, very uncomfortable. And it's certainly not politically correct, but I think one has to tell the truth. Those who went to France, something in the region of 20%, we're not sure, France, Belgium, and later Canada, and other places as well, were by and large the comfortable middle class and many of the leaders, not the religious leaders, but many of the modern leaders. And when any group travels en masse to another country, the leadership section is of unbelievable importance. They're the intermediaries between the new bureaucracy and their own population. And unfortunately, that didn't happen in the case that we're talking about. Ari, can you get back the slide? You started. Good. Okay, good. Thank you. So who were they? Who were the ones who didn't come to Israel? Relatively wealthy, French speakers, contact with local businesses, upwardly mobile, and they had family members wherever they went. Yeah, therefore, what we're actually seeing is this tragedy for Moroccan Jewry. And I'm not denying that there was discrimination. We heard from RABBI, for those of you who watch this program, speaking about in Shterot, it was very, very tough. Outskirts. Just one other comment. Robbie spoke about them going to Shterot. It's on the board, near the border of Gaza. small development towns. The reason is the government in Israel didn't want masses of people coming into the greater Tel Aviv area. It was already overpopulated. So they sent people to the marginal areas. Marginal areas, education isn't good, healthcare isn't good, and there are not many jobs. And this is a global phenomenon. I think one has to not see it just as an Israeli problem, but if any massive immigrants come into any country, basically the administration, if they have the possibility of controlling where they will live, will send them to marginal areas, and that happens here. And once again, without any leadership to act as intermediaries with the Israeli government of the time. Thank you. Next slide, please. Where did they come? And I call it population overload. There's a comment which, when I arrived in Israel in 1967, I would hear all the time. I think less so now. Israel loves immigration, but not immigrants. This is a fact, you know, it's kind of an interesting situation. The law of return enables people of Jewish background, and depending on parents and even grandparents, to come to Israel and become citizens. But you don't really know who the people are, and you don't know whether the group that's coming in is what the country needs at that time. The 60s faced a serious economic depression. The 50s, the economy was weak, but the 60s brought about a very serious economic depression. People were sent to isolated development towns. I was in some of the development towns in the late 60s, Yerucham and Dimona in the south, Bet She'an in the north. Not nice places, very, very depressed, miserable buildings, but that's where they were sent. And for those who were sent to Moshavim, the villages, you can see a picture there, very, very depressed kind of areas, but that was where you could put them. You didn't want them to be in urban slums. That would have been awful. So they were sent out to other areas. And in the Israeli idea of security, what you do is you, in the early days, you sent civilians to, in a sense, control the border, to hold the border. Remember, we're talking about a period of tremendous unrest between Israel and its neighbors. And therefore, you had to send, you couldn't have more people in Tel Aviv. There wasn't space. And they didn't have the money. Tel Aviv is an expensive place to buy property. So you sent them out because this, in a sense, held the border. I know it sounds strange, but there certainly weren't enough soldiers to hold all the borders of Israel, and certainly in the southern regions, where it was very easy to infiltrate. So civilian groups were in these development towns or moshavim, and that was tough for them. They were away from the developments in the country, and at the same time, they, in many cases, were insecure from a security perspective. Thank you. There's other issues. Language and culture, which we'll see, is a very interesting situation. Israel was very Ashkenazi. We know it was a totally Ashkenazi society. It's true that there were non-Ashkenazim before 1948. Yemenites had even arrived in the 1980s. There were a certain number of Iraqis who had arrived in the 1930s, but it was very much controlled by the socialist Zionist Ashkenazim, with a small number of Mizrahim who were in the Mapai Labour Party at that time. And it's also an issue of the language you speak. So Hebrew was important, but the Mizrahim spoke a different kind of Hebrew. In fact, the truth is that they really spoke correct Hebrew. Ashkenazim never really spoke correct Hebrew. The way one has to speak Hebrew is to know how to use the gutturals of Ayin and the Chet, which even myself, after 53 years in Israel, I can't quite get around. And interspersed with all of that, you would put Yiddish expressions. It was so interesting. I remember even in lectures sometimes at the Hebrew University, when I was a graduate student there, the lecturer would throw in an expression in Yiddish. It was kind of expected somehow. Well, that's okay if you come from a background where you have a little bit of Yiddish understanding, even if you're not fluent. And Israel in the 50s and 60s was committed to being a Western country, not a Middle Eastern country. Middle Eastern represented all the negative values which the new state could imagine. It represented Islam, the enemy. Islam is the enemy, not Islam as another religion. It represented the country at war. And therefore, the Arabic language, by the way, the dialect of Moroccan Arabic is a different dialect from the area around Israel. It's a kind of also got a Judaic components to its dialect. But knowing Arabic wasn't much good. If you knew French, that would be an advantage. And what are you seeing around the country at that period? You're seeing learning the Hebrew language. And what have you got there? Hello, shalom, and then shalom in English. I must just add another point that I remember in the 1960s that at the universities, there were very few Mizrahi students. One guy was a friend of mine, a very interesting fellow. And he told me all these kind of things that I'm saying now, which is now being researched. But he would even point out how that when he came from his development town in the south to Jerusalem, he felt he wasn't just going from one city to another city or to development town to a city, but he was going to a totally different environment. And therefore, language was very important. In the next slide, we'll see that this was the case also with culture. 50s and 60s culture. Now, here you're beginning to have an interesting mix. Language and clothing and religiosity remain to a large extent under the auspices of the Ashkenazim, but we'll speak about the changes in a moment. But there was a realm where the Mizrahi food was looked at as exotic. Exotic's a strange word. It's kind of something, it's kind of out of the way. You know, let's go and have what kind of an exotic meal are we going to have? It means it's foreign. It doesn't mean that it's a natural food. So there's always a strange kind of tension in this use of the word exotic. Clothing was very much Western. Some of the Moroccans dressed differently. And when we lived in Jerusalem, our next door neighbors were a Moroccan family. They'd been in Israel a long time. And they dressed differently, certainly the older people. So, you know, one could feel very quickly that this was a group different from one's own. Music in the early stage was very Western. Beethoven and Bach and Schubert, and that was the music. Now, Mizrahi music was coming in, but it wasn't normative yet. It wasn't fully accepted in society. And on the Western ear, Mizrahi music sounds very foreign. You get used to it. I mean, you get used to it. It's very pleasant, but it's a learning process. The other part is that by the 60s, the Zionist revolutionary movement, which had been so much a movement of change, was becoming conservative. And there wasn't the same sort of ability to deal with other. The leaders had been through the war, 1948 and then 1956. They'd moved into a conservative mode, and therefore you might have expected them, if you look at Zionism as a revolutionary movement, you might have expected them to be prepared to change. But in fact, the revolutionary movements become conservative at a certain time. And when most of the Moroccans were coming in, Zionism had moved into that mode, not really open-minded to totally different ethnic and religious groups. Thank you. Next slide, please. So what are we looking about in religion? Just let me say something about Moroccan religion, which is very different. If any of you have been to a Mizrahi Bet Knesset, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Firstly, the singing is very different. The Sefer Torah is in a kind of round Sephardi kind of fashion. You look upstairs, Ezrat Nashim, where the women are sitting, and there are almost no women there. I remember going to some of the synagogues in Jerusalem, the Sephardi synagogues near the Machane Yehuda Shuk, And I'd always ask, but where are the women going to sit? And they kind of looked at me and they said, well, only a few are going to come anyway. So why do we need to have too much space for them? Different kind of religion. And as I said, it didn't fit comfortably with Ashkenazi orthodoxy, which, if I could make a stereotype comment, Ashkenazi orthodoxy is very theological, very book-based. Moroccan religion is folklore-based, and I'm saying that in a positive sense. Moroccan Judaism is based on sages, of the saints, and much of Moroccan Jewish society was around those rabbis and those saint figures who were very much respected. And although there were two chief rabbis, for quite a long time, you would have the feeling that the Ashkenazi chief rabbi really had the major pull on what was going on. In fact, it's only really in the 1980s, that's a long time, almost 30 years or so since the Moroccans first came, that was absolutely understood that there had to be a religious and political respect for the Moroccans as being a different group. By the way, you don't have all these different tensions with the Yemenites and the Iraqis. Time is important, numbers is important, and the situation in Israel always makes a difference. Look at the Moroccan design of a synagogue. When they went into a regular Orthodox synagogue, Ashkenazi synagogue, it would seem totally strange to them. Theirs is different. It's more enclosed. It's a kind of a scented, a kind of a warmer environment, which we see in various parts of the world in modern Ashkenazi Orthodoxy, but we didn't always see it in early Orthodoxy in various countries. Next slide, please. As time goes by, there's adaptation. Adaptation is slow, and it's unfortunate, but that's a reality of what happens in societies where you have a large immigrant group. The MIMOUNA, the day after Pesach, is a big issue. This is what the Moroccans love. Now, this is a very important religious occasion. Maybe as an outsider, you would say, well, you know, religion is about studying Talmud in a synagogue, in a Bet Knesset. But that's not true. It took time before people realized that the Moroccans have different ways of looking at things. There's a very strong Geula, redemption component about a Moroccan Jewry. And just as during Pesach, we speak about ALIYAH Navi, we have a chair set aside for him. In Moroccan society, that concept is very important. In Jerusalem Park, a major park in downtown Jerusalem, every year you have this MIMOUNA ceremony. If we just look at the pictures, in the top picture, there's Ruby Rivlin, who is Israel's president. And in the lower picture, you have Dan Shapiro, who was the American ambassador in Israel. Dan still lives in Israel, and he's connected to research projects. So everyone dresses up, a lot of food, a lot of singing, a lot of joy, very Mediterranean. And I think this is already the new reality which Moroccans are beginning to feel. Maybe not as quickly as they wanted, and maybe not as broad as some of them wanted, but it's certainly there. Next one, please. The tension in religion came very much within the Haredi world. The Ashkenazi party, Ashkenazi Haredi party, was AGUDAT Yisrael. Changed the names at a later stage, but that's what it was initially known as. The Ashkenazim decided for internal political reasons, complex tensions between Misnagdim, Lithuanians and Latvians, and Hasidim, essentially Poles and Ukrainians, that division within the Ashkenazi camp brought about an unusual situation where an Ashkenazi rabbi, Rabbi Shach, decided to bring the Sephardim into the political Haredi world. I know it's sounding crazy, but just let's leave it at that. So what they did, they found this Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, we see his picture over there, who's actually an Iraqi rabbi, but he had status. He was a learned man, he had written books, very impressive. And so they set up the political party SHAS. SHAS, which appears in 1984, is a party, it's an unusual political party. The leaders are HAREDIM, the supporters are Masortim, are traditional people. But the SHAS party gave a tremendous sense of confidence to the Moroccans. At long last, they had a party which really represented them. At that time, by the way, many of them were already voting Likud because they favored Begin, Menachem Begin, a religious leader, rather than the very secular leaders which had been in the Labour Party. So they'd already moved to the political right. And SHAS was a political right party which had a very, very distinctive Judaic folklore component. And we see Aryeh Deri, who's kind of the political leader of the Moroccan group until today. Interestingly, as I say, led initially by an Iraqi family. Ovadia Yosef's children carry on leading SHAS. So you have that kind of situation. Well, here we come to yet another side, and that's the sociological side. They were saying we're not the second Israel. Wadi Salib, a very depressed area of Haifa, sees an uprising, a local uprising. It's not a massive one, but it was the first time that in Israeli society there'd been internal tensions. It's a restless Moroccan Jewish immigrant was shot by police, demonstrations, and people were arrested. A lot of tension. That became much worse in the next slide, which we're going to see. Ari, please, the next slide. Once again, the Black Panthers, 1971, similar situation, lower class, marginal Mizrahim, to a large extent Moroccans, school dropouts, demonstrate. They're living right in very tough areas, very close to the Muslim areas, the Arab areas of the old city, and they meet Golda Meir, and Golda Meir says, she has this discussion with them, and she comes out and they say, Madam Prime Minister, what can you say about them? And she uses the same expression, Hem einam anashim tovim. They're not nice people. So that stirs up things tremendously. By the way, I was in, my wife and I, Brenda, were in downtown Jerusalem that evening, and a Molotov cocktail was thrown. It was very, very frightening. At that moment, I must admit, I wondered whether there was going to be a civil war or not. Fortunately, there wasn't. Next slide, please. So what do you do in this situation? Here, Moroccans are feeling marginalized. They're getting a little bit of political power in the SHAS party. But what it made a lot of sense was to go back to traditional values, pure Moroccan sensitivities, and that comes about with this figure, Baba Sali. Baba Sali was a Moroccan rabbi who believed in miracles. And this Baba Sali movement, which exists in a small development town, Netivot, very close to the Gaza border, really inspired the Moroccans. It was as if they were bringing real Moroccan religion, folklore, intense, family-oriented, historical religion was coming to the core of Israeli societies. There were mass emotional ceremonies around Baba Sali. Every year at his Yortzeit, when they remember when he died, They're mass demonstrations, sometimes up to 150,000 people. The ABUHATZEIRA family, a well-known Moroccan family, which has had political people as well, has made a major business of this. And somewhat like you have with the Vilna Gaon and the Rema of Poland, you have all these portraits, Kiddush cups, menorahs, postage stamps, and plates. And you can see the headquarters of where the sage was buried where Baba Sali was buried. Beautiful building down there in Netivot. This has become, in a sense, almost, I'm exaggerating a little bit, almost the Jerusalem for Moroccan Jews. This is where saint worship carries on. Next one, please. Weddings, very popular. No longer are the Moroccans a marginal group. The henna system, which is very popular, where I mentioned there the background ideas of the system, but basically it's a rite of passage ceremony where it's a whole preparation for the marriage, and a lot of fun, a lot of eating, a lot of singing. The women wear these elaborate kind of clothes. In the summer, it's not too much fun. But once again, Moroccans late in the game have brought their culture into mainstream Israeli society. Next one, please. Music, come all the way from being marginal. We used to hear Moroccan music at the central bus station in Tel Aviv. It was kind of that place where you didn't expect it. Once again, exotic music that you wouldn't really expect to have too close to you in middle-class society. But the music has come in. Moroccan music is everywhere, on the radio, television, music festivals. It's right there in the middle. And not only that, and we're getting now to some interesting issues of the connection with modern Morocco. In December 2018, a Israeli orchestra of 100 musicians went to Morocco. And this is an interesting relationship with Morocco. You know, if we're going to fight over religion and politics, maybe we can get together on music and culture. And Moroccan Jewish singers in Israel are extremely popular for the big weddings. They will be out there making the audiences and the participants delighted. Thank you. Next one, please. And Israeli tourists visit Morocco, about 50,000 a year. It's massive. About 3,000 Moroccans come to Israel every year. The Moroccan government is very open, very positive. This is Muhammad VI, the son of Hassan II. Jews are welcomed. There's some YouTubes, by the way. There's a YouTube that you might want to see by Al Jazeera, which is a critical YouTube, but it has its interesting parts, where you see that local Moroccans are interviewed and they speak about the good times when the Jews live next to them. The king is seen here visiting a museum in a small town, and there's another one there too. There's a house of memory, and there's also a Jewish museum, kind of modest, but also an interesting indication. When the king in these kind of societies visits a synagogue or museum, Jewish museum, that's an important statement. And for a long time, Jews in Morocco have said, probably legitimately, that if the king looks after us, we're going to be okay. And that is exactly what the advisor, the Jewish advisor to the kings, has been saying as well. We're okay here, although there are just a few thousand Moroccan Jews left, because the king will look after us. It's good for the king to have the Jews around. The next one, please. And to get towards the end of our program, what's happening in Israel? What's the most contemporary comment that I can make. Our Minister of Culture, who's going to get a better position, higher level position in this coming government, Miri Regev, she personally faced discrimination as a young child. And she has come out with this very, very ongoing claim that the Moroccans are discriminated against, even till today, and absolutely everything has to be done to make sure that their voice is heard. She pushes the Moroccan case all the time. By the way, some of the other ethnic groups in Israel are beginning to wonder a little bit. I mean, you know, Minister of Culture, surely you should be concerned with the culture of all the multifaceted Israeli society organizations. But there's something which has developed. On the one hand, they're going to build a Sfarad, a Spanish museum in Netanya. You can see the model there, which will be absolutely beautiful. And as far as I'm concerned, it will be very good for Israel. But I have to mention something which is coming up more and more in research. And that is that I've seen it and I've read it, that Moroccans who are comfortably middle class today are beginning to say something very different what Miri Regev is saying. They're saying, give us a break. We know it wasn't good for our parents and grandparents, but now we're Israelis. And to be honest, I've been interested in this ethnic question for a long time, pretty much from the time that I came to Israel. And sometimes I'm sitting with people walking down the streets, we're sitting in the stand talking in the supermarket or something, and I know they're Moroccan. It's pretty clear, but they are not interested in the Miri Regev approach anymore. They want to just be Israelis. And so things have changed tremendously. When the time that they have a minister, two ministers, Miri Regev and Aryeh Deri, two Moroccan senior politicians, for those who are upwardly mobile, they're really quite happy to just be Israelis. That's an interesting story in itself. So thank you very much. And now we have time for questions. So over to Ari. Ari, thank you very much for your assistance.
Thank you. Always have a few challenges. I asked people to stop their videos at one point to see if that made a difference. You froze just for a little bit, but everything, I would say, overall worked out very well. So before I look at the chat and bring up some questions, a few thoughts or things to share. First of all, we are recording this program and we're streaming it live on Facebook right now. But we have a YouTube channel that we started last night for CSP where we've put all of Paul Lipps's lectures and other lectures for online lectures for CSP. So I'll be sharing that with all of you so you can enjoy and share and catch up if you came late and so on. The second is those of you coming to Israel with us, we are planning on going to Netivot to check out the grave of the Baba Sali and explore some of the issues that Professor Liptz mentioned. So stay tuned for that if you're joining us in Israel. But Professor Liptz, here's my first question, and I may have missed it due to dealing with technical issues on my side. I happened to be in Morocco in 1997 for Pesach. And first of all, I went to synagogue Erev Pesach, and there was a fight that broke out in the synagogue. People wanting to host us for Seders. We actually had plans, but it was really almost a fight. People were trying to drag us to their homes. Does not happen in the non-Sephardi, non-Mizrahi world. So I wanted to share that. It was amazing. And I was there for MIMOUNA. I've never seen anything like that. But I also met lots of Moroccans. It's a very different story than what we talked about last week with the Iraqi Jews. There are lots of Moroccan Jews who still live in Morocco. And obviously not as many as there were at one time. But the story I heard from them was an interesting story about going to Israel, which was that they didn't necessarily want to go to Israel, but Israel had sent emissaries out there to Morocco to convince them to move. And they used different ways to convince them. Is that a story you know about?
Sure.
What they're saying is they really shouldn't have left.
Yeah. By the way, it's mentioned a great deal. I would say, I'm sure in these kind of situations, many things are going on. When the emissaries were sent out, and also the Mossad, by the way, was sent out to try and help the people to leave, I'm sure the Israeli government and authorities thought that that was for the good of the population. They saw the population. They saw what was going on in the ghetto areas. They'd seen the anti-Semitism coming up and again. And so I'm sure that what the Israeli government does until today, by the way, it's been a consistent policy all along. When things are bad in France or Germany, the Israeli prime minister always says, you know, come home, come back to Israel because things are terrible for you. So I think that is probably true. I asked myself another question, and I don't have the answer, and that is this whole thing about if that was the case, if the Israeli government was pushing it so hard, they didn't have to come. And why is it in the 1960s, when it's pretty clear that life in Israel is pretty tough, why do they still leave and come to Israel or go to France? And it seems to me that sometimes the inner story of what happened in Morocco has been forgotten. I think that's what happens. You know, Jews, the 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 Jews who are still living in Morocco, I think what they really want, and I understand it, they want to say, this is our real home. They must be in discussion or argument with family members. We hear of that, by the way. Someone in Israel will say, still got a cousin in Morocco, and I don't know why they're staying. And then a year or two later, I'll hear from that person, oh, that person's living in such a great life. Maybe I should go and live there. Excuse me. So I think all these subtexts are correct. I don't think there's one story ever. And I think this is what you heard is probably what those who are living there actually feel. And there were definitely cases of sort of subtle encouragement by the Israeli government, which is true, by the way, of almost all immigrant populations that have come to Israel. By the way, even in the case of Rhodesia, there was a certain plan by the Israeli government. If things got bad when there was African nationalist leader coming in, I was asked to prepare a report on what the best way to get them out would be. So I can certainly say that's pretty much government policy.
Have you led any trips to Morocco? You know, I know you lead trips.
No.
So I do recommend, if you have not been to Morocco, I know some people are planning on going. Right now, all trips are up in the air, but when you do get a chance, when things settle down, definitely go to Morocco, visit with the Jewish community and see what's going on just in Morocco in general and the community. It's fascinating. Question from Eileen Ettinger. What is the relationship between the Israeli, Moroccan, and Iraqi populations? To expand it, maybe, is there a relationship between Moroccan communities and other sub-communities that you've been talking about?
Yeah, you know, now I think it's almost an economic issue. If you're middle class, and I think this is a global comment, middle class people, because you're pretty much on the same standard of living, and in most cases you're living in towns, you're not living in those little isolated villages, development towns. There's very, very easy relationships. I mean, I've been in both Hebrew University and Tel Aviv University altogether for 45 years. Between students, I think they aren't even aware almost of the differences. So that issue is being worked out. And I think it's all a matter of age and economic levels, which mean when you're in an isolated area, you don't have contact with other groups. And Shterot and Netibot and some of those are very, very ethnic areas, as are the Moshavim. In cities, by and large, Israelis are living side by side with each other today, I think, in most cases.
So, related question, what's the current percentage of intermarriage between Mizrahi and the non-Mizrahi parts of Israel?
Sorry, I didn't quite get the question.
What's the current percentage of intermarriage? Do you see lots of intermarriage? Is there, between the Mizrahi world and
the statisticians find it very difficult to answer. Why? Because you can have someone who doesn't know whether he or she is Mizrahi or non-Mizrahi. Because it depends, you might have a mother who's Bulgarian and your father's Moroccan. So who are you? And so it's very, very unclear. And I just want to indicate it by a little activity that I used to do in my class. I used to ask my Israeli students, who are you in terms of ethnic identity? And when I asked that question in the early 70s, when I started teaching in Tel Aviv, it would be very, very clear. About 60 or 65% of the students would throw up their hands and say Ashkenazi, and the others would say Mizrahi. 10 or 15 years later, and this was, I always laughed at this, 10 or 15 years later, their hands go like this. And what does the hands mean? They would ask me who they are. They would say, a mother comes from this country and the father comes from that country. Who am I? So I think at a certain time, knowing exactly what percentage of a group is very, very difficult. Statisticians sometimes take the background of the father. And if you do the background of the father, it's believed that the Mizrahim are something in the region of 45%. I would imagine about a third of them are going through intermarriage with with non-Mizrahi groups, with non-Moroccan groups. So they might be marrying a Yemenite or Iraqi, they might be marrying an American. So as I say, getting clear figures on this has become very, very difficult, which in a sense is a good sign. It says something about some of the improvements of Israeli society.
Linda Spitz wants to know, who issued the certificates that allowed people into Israel when they preferred Holocaust survivors?
Good question. The British allocated a certain number, and then there was a negotiation with the Jewish agency. Excuse me. The Jewish agency then allocated. And the Jewish agency policy, which has been a consistent policy all the way through Israeli history, was to allow those groups which are most endangered. And that is why there was the situation where Moroccan Jews wanted to come before the creation of the State of Israel. They did want to come. It was very hard for them to receive a certificate because Holocaust survivors from May 1945 onwards were given top priority. So the answer is, it was made by the government in making, basically. That was the Jewish agency at the time. Today, obviously, there are no restrictions. I mean, it's a different story.
Right. So last question, it kind of goes to the root of what we discussed last week, this week, and when you were here in January. And just to make sure we understand your perspective on this, the nature of the discrimination against the Mizrahi, is it because they look different? Is it because they have different culture? And where are we now with that kind of discrimination in Israeli society as of 2020?
You know, I've been studying migratory phenomenon for a long time. And it seems to me that people living in a country don't really spend a lot of time learning about the immigrant. You kind of had a general perspective. So, you know, I think what we actually, the answer is that it's dealing with the unknown, with the non-familiar. And I think that has a tremendous kind of impact on what was happening. So today, I think people like Miri Regev, and sometimes for very political reasons, speak about the deep division between this society. I must tell you, I remember the 70s and the 80s, and there were deep, deep ethnic tensions in Israel. I don't think it's true today. Now, it doesn't mean you can't find someone. You can go into the shuk in Machane Yehuda in Jerusalem, and you can speak to a Moroccan there, and he'll tell you some terrible things about another ethnic group. You can go to a Russian immigrant, and they can speak about discrimination. And all of those are true on individual levels. But I think, generally speaking, the position in Israel is a lot better. We've still got massive problems, but I think inter-ethnic issues are less serious than they were in the past. So I'm kind of happy on these kind of things. And as far as I'm concerned, let them build a lovely museum. It'd be a great place to learn more about Moroccan culture. So I think it's good for all of us.
Well, let me end by saying that, thank you for the great presentation. This issue about the sub-communities, the Moroccan community, Iraqi community, Yemenites, this is something that is really important to our trip that's coming up to Israel. As I've mentioned many times, it's what makes Israel a unique country. It's a beautiful tapestry of different communities, but it's also not easy. And there are still challenges. And I'm hoping that when we get there, we can explore and hear from the people themselves what's going on. That's why I'm actually looking forward to going to the grave of the Baba Sali in Netivot, for example, and some of the other communities.
You see, by the way, there, the Moroccan ethnicity is emphasized very much. You know, it's a center of ethnicity. By the way, it's very interesting who one speaks to. One speaks to the people who are ethnically aware, and one doesn't really speak to the people who've forgotten what their ethnicity is all about. So, you know, one has to look at it from two sides.
Okay, we will take that into consideration. So thank you. I wanted to mention again that we are live on Facebook. We have a YouTube channel. You'll be getting information about that. We have many programs coming up over the next few weeks while we remain sheltered in place here in the United States. Things will ease up, but many of us will still be at home. Mark Michael Epstein, a favorite of CSP, will be returning for a 3-part series. Rafi Zarm will be coming in for a series and multiple programs from the UK. Peter Geffen will be our summer scholar. I know that Joyce Pius had mentioned that she'd heard him speak. He's an excellent speaker, and he may actually do a follow-up series on Morocco in the future. Yiska Smith and Judy Klitzner will be teaching text. Avi Strasberg will be back next week. Robbie Greengrass will be back next week. So we have a lot coming up. I hope you will take a break from Zoom so you're fresh for CSP. The silver lining to the dark cloud of the pandemic is the incredible proliferation of opportunities on the internet, on Zoom. I want to thank you for choosing CSP. I want to thank Temple Beth Shalom and Peter Mesnick and people from all around the country for joining us. I got an email last week from someone in Barcelona, Spain, who is now participating in our program. So share our links for CSP. And it's great to have a national audience, and I'm looking forward to having an international audience. Thank you all for your chats, and have a great Sunday. Thank you, Professor Liptz. By the way, when we finish this series with American Jews next week, we are going to do another series on 3 more subcultures or subcommunities in Israel in a few weeks with Professor Liptz. So stay tuned for information about that. So with that, happy Sunday, everybody. Good. And enjoy your day.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Paul. Take care. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.